Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 51. I am the show's host, Kyle. Thank you, everybody who's sharing the show. Every show, the download numbers are better, so for everybody who's clicking the share button and recommending it to friends, it's really paying off. In today's show, I got a whole bunch of news to talk about. If you're interested in spreading the message on Liberty News and of non-interventionism, then send people to the show, let them know about the show. It will help to make a difference. I really believe, Ron Paul says this, and it's something that I definitely believe as well, which is that if the American people know the truth about the foreign policy, then they're going to reject the foreign policy. If they realize how expensive, destructive, and immoral it is, there's no way they'll continue to allow it to happen. But because of the narrative that's given to the people by the U.S. government through their mouthpiece of the mainstream media, we consistently have a misinformed population voting for leaders who want more of the same foreign policy while they pretend to have opposing ideas. And so it leads us to a situation where the Middle East is on fire. Americans have created more hostility and blowback for themselves in the West than ever, and the world is a more dangerous place today, and it's a less wealthy place than it should be because of America's interventionism. I'm going to start off talking about the Qatar situation. I talked about this a lot on the previous episode. I'm going to get into all the updates. The reason I think this is important to U.S. foreign policy is I think it has a lot to do with the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and it's very reflective of Trump's, I think, inability to understand what's going on. So to get into all of it, just a brief background, I guess, is that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, as well as a few other countries cut ties with Qatar, including closing the borders with those countries, closing the ports, closing the airports. The UAE has even gone so far as to stop all postal deliveries to Qatar, and so really the business has shut down between these countries. Qatar, of course, is a small country that sits off the coast of Saudi Arabia and kind of jets into the Persian Gulf. It's a tiny country. I think there's about 200,000 native Qataris, and then I have no idea how many additional people. Qatar is a Sunni majority country. It does have a substantial Shia minority population that it does work to appease. It's a kingdom, pretty much a complete dictatorship. I'm not sure how much representation there is in the country. To some extent, the leaders always, I guess, have to appease the people enough that they're not willing, to carry out terrorist attacks against the government at all times. Qatar is an energy-rich country. The kingdom is very rich and has used this money to finance terrorists, finance the Muslim Brotherhood, buy and send weapons to terrorist groups within Syria. Qatar also has I would say the best diplomatic relationship with Iran of the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, other than maybe Oman. That relationship that Qatar has with Iran is what triggered this split between Qatar and these other Muslim countries. This has gotten so extreme that Saudi Arabia has actually issued Qatar a list of demands saying that Qatar must apologize and I guess repudiate all ties that the country has with Iran, and they also want Qatar to disband the news media outlet Al Jazeera. Saudi Arabia also demands that Qatar turn over some of its citizens, or at least stop some of its citizens from financing terrorist groups and Muslim Brotherhood linked groups, and the demand for Qatar to stop its support for Muslim Brotherhood as well. So since the original story, and I have added some details in already, Djibouti basically gave a statement saying they downgraded their diplomatic relationship with Qatar. They didn't say in that statement exactly what that meant, so I'm assuming not very much, but Chad has cut ties with Qatar as well, recall their ambassador, and so they're joining Saudi Arabia there. Now, some interesting developments is the Turkish parliament voted in favor of allowing Turkish troops to be stationed in Qatar. This is not a move of aggression towards Qatar. It's actually a move of support and defense towards Qatar for Saudi Arabia. They actually just built a military base there, and stationing a whole bunch of Turkish troops in Qatar would add to Saudi Arabia's inability to attack Qatar. There's also 10,000 U.S. troops stationed in Qatar at America's largest base in the Middle East. One of the things, I guess, with Qatar being a small nation that's very energy rich, but there's not much farmland, and there's a whole lot of people that live there, so they require a lot of food imports. I guess they had previously received those food imports through Saudi Arabia. However, Turkey and Iran have offered to fill in the gaps there and to start sending in that aid to Qatar. Excuse me, I guess that wouldn't be aid. I guess it would be food sales, but much needed food. The civilian population there needs it. Qatar's reaction to all of this, including to the Saudi demands and Saudi Arabia making it a vague threat. They didn't really say what would happen if Qatar didn't give in to the demands, but it seemed to suggest that military action could be a result of Qatar failing to meet those demands. The letter almost reminded me of something I once saw in The Office, where Michael Scott's reading a message, and at the end he says, "You have 24 hours," but doesn't give a demand or an incentive or what will happen if you don't meet his demands within 24 hours. And that's essentially what Saudi Arabia then did. They just said, do these things or else, and Qatar said, well, we're going to do the same thing. The official position that Qatar has taken is that they are not going to change their foreign policy. I guess they're saying they're going to stay the course. It seems like they have an awful lot of support from some outside nations, as well as the U.S.-based station there has to be a pretty important piece on the battlefield. So the question being, how long can Qatar hold out? Having all of your neighbors around you hating you and not trading with you and not allowing you to cross those borders is going to cause a major inconvenience, and definitely hurt the economy of Qatar. I'm sure it's going to create a black market. Black markets always breed violence, and so this is going to cause problems for the country. And if, let's say, the U.S. and Turkey were to pull their bases out, I guess you could logistically see a Saudi invasion of Qatar or something like that. I mean, we could go to that extent. I'm not saying that that's going to happen or is likely to happen, but it is certainly something that people are throwing out there as a possibility. Now, Qatar does hold a lot of pieces. Like I said, they have the U.S. base there. They have support from Iran and Turkey. This is another interesting thing. Turkey and Saudi Arabia being on the opposite side of this argument. I would suspect that one of the reasons is because of Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey has been very resistant to giving up its support for Syrian rebel groups, even if they are jihadist-linked groups. There was a lot of evidence and suspicion that ISIS oil trucks were, at least the government was turning a blind eye to ISIS oil being sold in Turkey. And so for Turkey and Saudi Arabia to end up on opposite sides of this issue could, I guess, be a problem for either of those countries moving forward. It does seem to me that would put Saudi Arabia a little bit more on the outs, because Turkey is a NATO ally, that relationship being stronger. However, the other NATO countries like Germany are moving further away from Turkey, so I guess either country could really end up suffering from this, but it could really change the dynamics in the Middle East and how some of the positions on the board are. Qatar, for their part, has supported the Muslim Brotherhood and other more radical jihadist type groups in Syria as compared to Saudi Arabia even, and so maybe this is why that support for Turkey is showing up for Qatar. Iran has a strong military, and then they're ready to fight, and so I don't know if Iran would go to war for Qatar, but that alliance and relationship is certainly something that exists. And if the divide between Qatar and Saudi Arabia will likely draw Iran to having a closer relationship with Qatar. The exact opposite thing, mind you, that most Americans say that they want in the Middle East. They want Iran to be more isolated. And here again, we have one of our allies pushing other countries in the direction of Iran. Qatar also, like I said, very rich country. They bought in a lot of weapons over the years. Those weapons are going to be used to defend the country if the country is attacked. It'd certainly be very interesting since all the other countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure about Bahrain, but Egypt certainly have all received a lot of weapons from the United States. So this could be a situation where a whole bunch of American weapons go to war against each other in the Arabian Peninsula there. Qatar, also a huge exporter of natural gas. They sit on huge natural gas reserves. I believe they actually provide something like 80 to 90% of the UK's natural gas to them, which amounts to 17% of the United Kingdom's overall energy consumption and usage. And so this is huge because energy prices would certainly skyrocket in the UK, and they would certainly have to look for other places to get their natural gas, and it's an odd situation because I think other countries that have a lot of natural gas would be Russia, and it could be a very difficult situation for the UK because they could be really left out of the natural gas market, which accounts for a lot of their energy consumption. And so this is definitely a card that Qatar could play on the international stage. They could force the UK to support them. I don't think the UK has as much love for Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as the United States does. While the UK has continued to support and sell Saudi Arabia weapons through their efforts to slaughter the Yemenis, that support has been questioned a lot more heavily in the UK than the United States. And so I do want to touch on now what Trump's role in all of this was. We have to do quite a bit of speculation here. We don't know what Trump's thinking. Is he an evil genius? Is he a mastermind? Or is he just a fool? And it seems to me that on this position, he's getting hoodwinked. He has no real idea of what's going on. He hasn't studied anything. He doesn't know the long-term history between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and doesn't understand the intricacies of the relationship in that these are two Gulf Arab states. They're both part of the GCC. So I think in Trump's mind, for Saudi Arabia to go after Qatar, they must really be the problem. I think what happened was that when Trump and the King of Saudi Arabia put their hands on the orb, they shared some thoughts. Trump says, I want to keep supporting you guys, but you guys got to cut out the funding of the terrorists, because I'm sure that people in his cabinet have said that the funding for terrorism comes through in a lot of ways from Sunni Arab states. And Saudi Arabia says, oh, well, that's really not us. That's mostly Qatar over there. And so Trump gets the idea in his mind that the problem is Qatar, and then goes and says, well, now I could sell you these $100 billion worth of weapons because I have no fear that you guys are going to go and give them to the jihadists like those dastardly Qataris over there. So this occurs a couple weeks ago, and then Qatar comes out and makes statements that are at least anti-war with Iran. That's the pretty much the best way you could say it. Qatar basically just said that we don't think war with Iran is a good idea. Saudi Arabia hates Iran and, wants really to go after Iran and undermine Iran, and any of the GCC countries saying that they're not in full support of destroying Iran is a problem for Saudi Arabia. And so they have this opportunity now that Trump gave them. They could score some big points with the big orange man in DC by saying, hey, look, now we could punish the Qataris, and they made us mad anyway, so now we'll just say we're cutting ties with them due to their support of terror. So Trump tweets out, oh yeah, look what just happened here. I talked to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia about not supporting terrorism anymore, and they said no more ties with Qatar. Trump's feeling pretty good about himself, thinking he was a pretty slick negotiator and helped reduce the support for terrorism in the Middle East. And then it turns out the situation is a hell of a lot more complicated than he thought. Suddenly there's a potential war between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Qatar is now moving towards the Iranians. Turkey is splitting away from Saudi Arabia on the issue. And suddenly what Trump thought was a great play on his part becomes a situation where this is really getting out of hand for the United States. We have allies battling each other. We have countries moving closer to Iran. The UK is probably upset because a big part of their energy consumption is now in a situation where maybe war breaks out in that country. Maybe that country starts seeing like sanctions from the UN, or any number of dangerous things could come out of this to where it would hurt the diplomatic ties between Qatar and the US and the UK. And on Trump's behalf, he has 10,000 troops in Qatar. And so, I mean, you really have to ask yourself, what's going on here? This looks like a mess. So then you get him tweeting out and saying that he wants to mediate the session between Qatar and Saudi Arabia so they could work out their problems. In reality, I think what he wants to do is he wants to get them in the room together, clump their heads together and say, you idiots, stop fighting. We need to stop this Assad guy, or we need to stop this terrorism, or something like that. So now the situation is really a geopolitical mess on the Arabian Peninsula, and I don't think Trump really knows what to do with it. Maybe this will be a sign to him that he needs to start reading more, or something like that. These issues, while complex and while it does take some time to understand it, they're not ununderstandable. They're not something that you can't comprehend. You could certainly do some time, do some reading, look at the relationship, the history between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, look at the history of Qatar and Saudi Arabia support for jihadist groups and Qatar support for Muslim Brotherhood groups, and how Qatar has some ties to Iran, and run through all of this, and then you can make it as an educated decision on what to do, and why you don't need to go sticking your finger in everybody's business overseas. I don't know if that's likely coming out of Trump, so it's just, I guess we'll see how this all turns out, but I don't have super great expectations that Trump is going to be able to handle it. Maybe the countries will realize that, war and diplomatic separation is only an economic loss for everybody involved, so we'll just move past this and kind of pretend it never happened. Most of these countries are kingdoms anyways. They don't have to worry about getting elected or anything. They just use the state media to say whatever they want and move on past it. The White House issued a statement on the Iranian terror attacks. I do want to touch on this. People are making a big deal out of this, and I don't know if this is a place where Trump is absolutely incorrect. So the White House releases a report saying that they sympathize for the victims of the attack, and that it's, a real tragedy. All those kind of words that nobody really means, that they wrote down on a piece of paper to send across to Iran, because they're busy putting sanctions on Iran. Do you really think they care about the Iranian people when they're putting sanctions on them? Absolutely not. And then the next sentence of the White House statement was just to say that this is the result of when your government sponsors terrorist groups, as kind of like saying that, hey, Iran, this is blowback for your support for terrorist groups. Now, let me point out where this report is flat wrong. It's assuming that Iran supports terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are Sunni-based jihadist terrorist groups. That's absolutely incorrect. Iran fights against these groups. I think there has been some suspicion that Iran had some sympathy or some ties with Al-Qaeda, but it seems that that's long since been moved past, and if it did occur, it was very minimal. Certainly since 2014, since 2003 in Iraq, but since 2014 in Iraq and Syria, Iran has been supporting groups fighting against Sunni extremist groups in Syria, in Al-Qaeda, in ISIS, and fighting against ISIS in Iraq. And so Trump is assuming that the Iranians are supporting these terrorist groups, and they're not doing it because he hears terrorists and he thinks Al-Qaeda. The troops that Iran is backing in the fight against ISIS are what I would consider extremist groups. They commit extrajudicial killings, they torture, they organize redistributions of populations to change demographics. They certainly don't have much concern about civilian casualties. After the liberation, so-called, of Tikrit, Ramadi, and Fallujah, more like the destruction of those cities, but after all of those, there was reports of the Shia militia, the popular mobilization forces, carrying out killings and torturings of civilians, looking for any and all ISIS members. I think to some extent there really wasn't much of a judicial process. It was, if you were accused of being in ISIS, you were probably going to be taken to a trench and shot in the back of the head. And I don't want to overstate that, so maybe it wasn't to that extent, but there were certainly reports of all these things going on. People tortured, confession saying that they weren't ISIS. Maybe they weren't. Maybe they just gave in to the torture. And so my assumption would be that the backlash, that the motivation for the terrorists was less likely Iran's any so-called support Iran has for Sunni extremist groups, but was definitely caused by Iran's support of Shia military groups that go and carry out atrocious acts overseas. Much like what the U.S. has faced with blowback, dealing with their slaughter of civilians in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, their forced support for Saudi Arabia and their starvation of Yemen, and, wars in Libya, where it's just to destabilize the country and then they leave and it creates just a huge mess and power vacuum. And so the other thing that Trump absolutely has no realization of is like how contradictory this is. Take your own advice, man. Like, if you want to reduce the number of terrorist attacks that are occurring, first stop your support for terrorists. And the U.S. has resumed some support to the Free Syrian Army, which is openly allied with jihadist groups. And then you have the U.S. carrying out atrocious acts overseas, killing civilians hundreds at a time now. We had tortured people in Guantanamo Bay, and I'm sure if you're somebody who lives in the Middle East, you're not so sure that torture isn't still going on. Acts of blockade and starvation like what's happening in Yemen, and then the war against Gaddafi in Libya. All of these things combined are certainly things that Trump should look at and say, like, oh, the advice I'm giving Iran I should take for myself, and so we should stop doing all these awful things. But for some reason, I doubt Trump will take his own advice. We could only hope that he will see the irony and the hypocrisy of his statements and turn around and do something different. We have a story of the military recommending more U.S. bases be shut down. I think most of these bases are within the United States, and then the troops be located elsewhere. The U.S. has way too many bases. The military has been asking the Congress to close bases for years. Congress never does it because military bases are a boon to the nearby towns. So if you have a military base within your congressional district and you were to vote to close that military base, I doubt you would hold your job for the next term. All these things always end up in one bill. So there'll be 20 military bases maybe that they're trying to close, and so you have 40 senators now who say, well, we can't close those bases. I'm sure some of these bases lie on or near state lines, and so maybe there's actually 50 or so senators who absolutely cannot vote for these bills without risking being voted out of office next time. So a lot of the time the military says, hey, we don't need this stuff, but the Congress says, well, we're going to keep buying it because we can't vote against it because of the economic bubble that the government had created by building the bases in these areas in the first place. A story out of Ukraine said the parliament and then the leader of Ukraine approved a resolution that would move Ukraine towards joining NATO. I definitely don't have time to talk about all of this in this episode, so I'm not going to get into it too much. I have talked in the past about U.S. relationship with Ukraine, Russia, Crimea, and so I'll link to one of those episodes in the show notes if you want. This is exactly why Crimea seceded and wanted to join Russia. The people of Crimea didn't want to have it be involved in an alliance that was hostile against Russia, and so they elected to leave and join Russia. At the time, some people who are Russia hawks were saying that that was a fantasy and that Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO, but at the same time, there are people who advocate for Ukraine to join NATO, and so now we do have a problem that if Russia may not be okay with Ukraine joining NATO, it would be very similar to NATO or to Russia, like restarting the Warsaw Pact and then adding either Russia or Canada to it. And it's not only that, because the U.S. also has NATO and Estonia and Latvia involved within. Those countries are all, on the border with Russia as well. And so you have situations where you're putting Russia in a position where they're going to feel very, very threatened. And so I would hope that the U.S. will back down and not approve the Ukraine to join NATO. But man, it really seems like something that John McCain and the rest of the cronies really want to see have happen. The U.S. was also recently flying B-52 nuclear capable bombers parallel to the Russia border over the Baltic Sea. I don't know how far away they were from the Russia border. When this happened, some Russian fighter planes came, and then I guess intercepted the US B-52s and flew with them until the B-52s flew away from the Russia border. This only seems to be an absolute provocation of Putin. It's asking for a conflict the US is trying to gain from carrying out missions like this. Congress passed a resolution condemning the attack of the Turkish bodyguards on the protesters in D.C. Turkey came out and said passing the resolution wasn't within the spirit of the alliance between Turkey and the United States. Seems so ridiculous to me. Just own up to your bodyguards beating up on some poor protesters. Moving overseas, we have Al-Shabaab carrying out an attack against a Somalian government military base. They killed over 60 soldiers and then stole 16 vehicles. I think the 16 stolen vehicles will probably be a huge threat, especially if they're military vehicles. I know a big strategy of ISIS has been to load military vehicles up with explosives and then drive them right into military bases because a lot of times they're armored and able to withstand some fire. And so you could really get these vehicles right up to the checkpoints of the base. The Iraqi Kurdish groups have announced that they'll have a referendum vote in September, towards the end of September, voting on independence from Iraq. Kurdish leaders have come out and said that this doesn't necessarily mean secession, but it would mean a more independent Kurdistan within Iraq. So we'll see what happens. It'll be interesting to see if there's any polling that comes out maybe over the summer. The other important note from that story is that Iraqi leadership did say the vote would include not only the borders of Kurdistan 2013, but the borders of Kurdistan as the Kurds have assumed ground that was once held by ISIS. We have the U.S. carrying out more airstrikes against the Assad government around Al-Tamf. First being Tuesday when they carried out the second strike within, I believe, 3 weeks. The most interesting part about this is that, I guess, hours before the U.S. carried out strikes against the Saudi allied troops, Assad asked the Russians to ask the United States to carry out strikes against groups that were attacking some Assad allied troops in the same region. The U.S. went ahead and carried out those strikes. So, within a matter of a few hours, the U.S. attacked the same group and then defended the group and then attacked them. All this happened within, I believe, about a 6-hour span. It shows the absolute schizophrenic nature of the U.S. foreign policy and how they have absolutely no idea what they're doing in Syria. You can't defend a group and then attack them because they move a few hundred yards forward. And this seems to be what happened, is that the U.S. has drawn this line in the sand in the southeastern Syrian desert and said, Assad government, you no longer own this area. This is now ours, and if you enter into it, we're going to bomb you. Even if that prevents Assad from being able to fight terrorists in his own country, the United States just doesn't care. Our policy is going to be to carry out a policy that's going to prevent Assad from ridding his country of terrorists sooner. The U.S. then carried out another strike against these same Assad allied forces on Thursday. This strike, again, 20-something kilometers from the U.S. base at Al-Tamf. What the U.S. continues to say is that our troops are threatened and that's why we're carrying out the airstrikes, but really it has to be to prevent the completion of a road from Baghdad to Damascus that would really allow Assad to wage a really complete war against the Syrian rebels. It would allow a lot of arms to flow from Iran to Syria and Assad. The Pentagon released a report on a mosque that was struck, I believe it was March 16th. The Pentagon says that only one person was killed in that strike. However, at least 39 civilians are reported to have died in that strikes by international aid agencies. The U.S. did not interview anybody on the ground before they released this report. They only reviewed old footage. They didn't even go and observe the site or anything like that. Like I said, they just looked at the footage. They say that they saw one small person entering the building. They don't even have the decency to identify that small person who was killed by the U.S. drone strike as a child. So the U.S. killed a child, but like I said, Pentagon doesn't have the courage to say that. And so this is just another this is just another assault on morality by the Pentagon, absolutely just lying about the terror they create overseas. Just a quick update on Yemen. Recent reports about the epidemic of cholera in Yemen say that 100,000 people have now been affected by cholera in Yemen and nearly 800 people have died from cholera in Yemen. This is an absolute tragedy. There's millions, like 7 million people in Yemen starving to death. And then if you're lucky enough to eat, then maybe cholera will kill you, which just means you'll vomit and diarrhea until you die. And so just an awful situation for the poor people of Yemen. Anything that we could do to prevent that conflict, including calling your senators and telling them to support Dr. Rand Paul and Senator Chris Murphy's bill that would prevent the sale of more weapons to Saudi Arabia. Alright, that'll do for the show this week, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back on Monday with Foreign Policy Focus, episode 52. If you're interested in what I'm doing, check out my news roundups. They appear on my website, kylesfilesblog.com, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S, on my Facebook page, Kyle's Files, and on the libertarianinstitute.org. I put stuff out on Facebook and Twitter somewhat regularly, more so on Facebook than Twitter, but I do the Twitter thing. I'm at KYAAALE. You join the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus, where we discuss foreign policy news. Like I said, I posted some stories and stuff in there. Some other guys do as well. It's a pretty cool group. So everybody enjoy your weekends and share the show.